over here, it says the Spanish-American War. The heading says One American Story. Jose Marti, a poet and journalist, was forced to leave Cuba in the 1870s. In those years, Cuba was a Spanish colony, and he had spoken out for independence. Marti later described the terrible conditions the Cuban people suffered under Spanish rule. This primary source is a quote from Jose Marti, mentor of the Cuban nation, and it says, "Cuba's children suffer an indescribable bitterness as they see their fertile nation enchained and also their human dignity stifled, all for the necessities and vices of the Spanish monarchy." That's the end of the quote. In New York City, Marti began to plan a Cuban revolt against Spain that began in 1895. Marti's lifelong struggle for Cuban independence made him a symbol of liberty throughout Latin America. But U.S. disapproval of Spain's treatment of Cubans led to the Spanish-American War. The next section says American interests in Cuba, and the key question asks, how did Americans respond to the Cuban Revolution? When the first English colonies were established in America, Spain had a worldwide empire. This empire grew until it covered most of the Americas, including land that became part of the United States. But by the 1890s, Spanish power was crumbling, and only a few of its colonies remained. Among them were the Philippine Islands in the Pacific and the Caribbean islands of Cuba and Puerto Rico. Many of the inhabitants of these colonies had begun to demand independence. The next section says Cubans rebel against Spain. Cubans had unsuccessfully revolted against Spain several times. In 1895, anger over poor economic conditions came to a boiling point, and the Cubans rebelled again against Spanish rule. Jose Marti, who helped to organize the rebellion from New York, went back to Cuba. He was killed in a skirmish with Spanish troops shortly after his return, but the revolt continued. Spain treated the rebels and other Cubans harshly. Many Cubans were forced from their homes and placed in camps guarded by Spanish troops. Thousands died of starvation and disease. The next section reads Yellow Journalism. The revolt in Cuba caused alarm in the United States. Business leaders were concerned because the fighting disrupted U.S. trade with Cuba. Most Americans, however, became outraged when the press began to describe the brutality of Spanish officials. Two New York City newspapers, in particular, stirred up people's emotions. The New York World, owned by Joseph Pulitzer, and the New York Journal, owned by William Randolph Hearst, were battling for customers. Both owners were able to attract readers by printing stories that described and often exaggerated news about Spanish cruelty. This sensational style of writing was known as yellow journalism. It was named after the Yellow Kid, a popular comic strip that ran in both newspapers. The next section says America declares war. William McKinley, the U.S. president in 1898, did not want war. "I have been through war," he had told a friend. "I have seen the dead piled up, and I do not want to see another." But American public opinion forced McKinley to take action. He demanded that Spain halt its harsh treatment of Cubans. Riots had broken out in Havana, the Cuban capital. In January 1898, McKinley sent the battleship USS Maine to Havana to protect U.S. citizens. On February 15th, the Maine exploded and sank. 266 American sailors died. No one knows what caused the explosion. Many historians today believe that it was an accident. Most Americans blame Spain. "Remember the Maine" became a call to arms. On April 20, 1898, President McKinley signed a congressional resolution that called for Cuba's independence and demanded a withdrawal of Spanish forces. Spain responded by breaking off diplomatic relations with the United States. The stage was set for war. So below it says causes and effects. Explain the American response to the Cuban Revolution. The next section reads the battles for the Philippines and Cuba. And the key question that you want to answer is what was the outcome of the Spanish-American War? In 1898, America went to war against Spain to fight for Cuban freedom. But the first major battle of the Spanish-American War took place in the Philippine Islands, a Spanish colony in the Pacific Ocean, on the other side of the world. Many Filipinos, as the inhabitants of the islands are called, had also revolted against Spanish rule in the 1890s. Okay, this section says the war in the Philippines. On April 30th, 1898, the American fleet in the Pacific steamed to the Philippines. American Commodore George Dewey had the support of the head of the Filipino rebel forces, Emilio Aguinaldo. The next morning, May 1st, Dewey gave the command to open fire on the Spanish fleet at Manila, the Philippine capital. In 7 hours, Dewey's men had destroyed the Spanish fleet. About 380 Spanish sailors were dead or wounded. No Americans died. U.S. troops, aided by Filipino rebels, took control of Manila in August. Dewey became an instant hero in the United States. Some babies born at the time of the victory in Manila Bay were named for him, and a chewing gum called Dewey's Chewies became popular. The next section says the war in the Caribbean. When the Spanish-American War began, the U.S. Army had only 28,000 men. Within 4 months, over 200,000 more joined up. Among the new recruits was Theodore Roosevelt, who had resigned from the U.S. Navy Department to volunteer. Roosevelt helped to organize the first U.S. volunteer cavalry. This unit was nicknamed the Rough Riders. Its recruits included cowboys, miners, college students, New York policemen, athletes, and Native Americans. In June, the Rough Riders and about 15,000 other soldiers, including 4 regiments that were African American, gathered in Tampa, Florida. They then set out for Santiago, a Spanish stronghold in southern Cuba. When the Rough Riders arrived, their dark blue wool uniforms were too hot for the Cuban climate. Also, many of the soldiers came down with tropical diseases. Even so, they fought their way toward Santiago. In order to gain control of Santiago's port, American troops had to capture San Juan Hill. They attacked the Spanish on July 1st. African American soldiers from the 10th Cavalry began to drive the Spanish back. Roosevelt and the Rough Riders joined them as they rushed forward and captured the hill. 2 days later, American ships destroyed Spain's fleet as it tried to escape Santiago harbor. On July 17th, the city surrendered. A week later, U.S. forces took Puerto Rico. Finally, on August 12, 1898, Spain signed a truce. To U.S. Secretary of State John Hay, it had been a splendid little war. For Spain, 4 centuries of glory had come to an end. Although Americans had declared war to secure Cuba's independence, U.S. leaders began demanding that Spain also give up its other colonies. At the Treaty of Paris in 1898, the former Spanish colonies of Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines came under U.S. control. Now the United States had to decide how much independence it would allow its new territories. The next section reads The New American Empire, and the key question asks, how did Americans view their nation's new power? One of the most challenging questions for U.S. leaders after the war was what to do with the Philippines. Filipinos had fought alongside Americans during the Spanish-American War and believed that Spain's defeat would bring them independence. But President McKinley, in the spirit of imperialism, decided that the Philippines should become an American colony. Disappointed, Filipinos, led by Emilio Aguinaldo, began to fight against their new colonial rulers. American troops were not able to put down the Filipino rebellion until 1902. Cuba and Puerto Rico. Cuban independence was granted by the Treaty of Paris, but Cuba remained under the control of the U.S. military. The American position was that rapid withdrawal might jeopardize Cuban stability. Cuba was forced to add the Platt Amendment to its constitution. This gave the United States the right to intervene in Cuban affairs any time there was a threat to life, property, and individual liberty. Cuba also had to allow a U.S. naval base at Guantanamo Bay. Puerto Rico became an American territory. The United States set up a government and appointed the top officials. Puerto Ricans were allowed little say in their own affairs. In 1917, the United States would agree to make Puerto Rico a self-governing territory and grant U.S. citizenship to all Puerto Ricans. The next section reads, The Anti-Imperialist League. U.S. treatment of Spain's former colonies after the Spanish-American War disappointed many people in the United States. Several influential Americans, including former President Grover Cleveland, businessman Andrew Carnegie, reformer Jane Addams, and writer Mark Twain, joined with others to form the Anti-Imperialist League. Members of the League believed that Americans should not deny other people the right to govern themselves. Primary source, which was a quote from the platform of the American Anti-Imperialist League, reads, We hold that the policy known as imperialism is hostile to liberty. We regret that it has become necessary in the land of Washington and Lincoln to reaffirm that all men, or whatever